Now, I want to just tackle kind of like the elephant in the room because I know exactly what I'm going to hear from a lot of people on the political right in response to this stream, which is it was obviously voter fraud. That's obviously why we lost the election. It was all fraud. It was all rigged. There's no point in voting ever again. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in every election cycle, I'm sure there is some, particularly with male voters, voter fraud. But in terms of this election cycle, the voter fraud is not what caused the GOP to do so poorly. Abortion was also changing demographics, which doesn't, people often think that's just a smokescreen for saying race or ethnicity. The political demographics pertain to so many different groups in society that I can't even begin to get into it here. It could be education, it could be geography, it could be sex. It could be marital status, religion, so on and so forth. It pertains to a lot of different stuff. And the Republicans are on the losing end of rapid demographic shifts. So that's a big thing that was running against them, particularly in key states. Also, the COVID era regulations about mail voting that a lot of states adopted are not going away, even though COVID's no longer a big deal. And that's not surprising because what happens is that the Democrats don't need fraud. What they can do is simply send a ballot to every registered voter if they control the a state government, so they could be able to do this in the first place. Then the party, not the state government, would go around to all registered Democrats and ask them, "Did you send back your ballot?" And they actually have very detailed basically stats, which indicate who votes typically, who votes atypically, and they would go after the atypical voters. They wouldn't obviously waste time with typical voters. They would go after the atypical voters, either doing a house call or a phone call or a text message, and they would do this in order to motivate these people to send back their mail ballot. And in some states, it's as simple: you could vote a straight ticket, so very without even having to do the whole ticket. In some states, people just will fill in a bubble, and that's it. So it's really interesting to see how the Democrats have been able to inflate turnout simply because of these postal ballots. They have definitely figured out how to get voters out that typically would be. Now, if we were back in 2014, which is the last time the GOP had a really strong midterm victory, the voting regulations were far different across the country. There was far less mail voting, overwhelmingly in-person voting, much more election day voting. And it's actually the Republicans who tended to do well with mail voting, but then that changed. But even back then, there were no automatic ballots sent to you for life or anything like that. And neither party really had a good apparatus of trying to motivate infrequent voters. Is just whoever wants to get the ballot gets the ballot, and the parties would instead focus on actual physical turnout, either in early voting, which wasn't even as widespread then, or of course election day voting. Now election day voting across the country makes up a diminishingly small amount of overall ballots cast, and most votes on election day obviously are Republican. But the Republicans do have the edge with in-person early voting, particularly in Florida, where I'm from. They do an outstanding job of it, and they don't have ballot harvesting. They don't have these ballots sent to you for life via mail. So that's why the Democrats here are not able to they're able to have good turnout. They're basically, because of the rules of the state, and also their immense financial woes, stuck in 2014, whereas Democrats, say in Georgia or in New Hampshire or in Arizona, are very much in 2022, barreling toward 2024. So it's unique, but the fact of the matter is that these ballots being sent out by mail are absolutely a gold mine of potential for the Democrats. They know how to get their voters to send their ballots back. The GOP still has to focus on actually turning voters out physically, and there's good and bad to that. I'll say before obviously the conversation goes back to you. The good of it is that you don't have to worry about ballots getting lost in the mail. You don't have to worry about people deciding, well, it's not worth it, blah blah blah. If people actually are, if they're bused to the polls, they're at the polls, and if they are voting at the polls, at the polling station in the traditional sense, the ballots cast, and that's that. But the Democrats Democrats do know how to juice up turnout with these mail with these postal ballots. So this is, it's a unique situation. The Democrats obviously have the upper hand in states where there are these ridiculous vote by mail laws, whereas the Republicans in some place like Florida that doesn't have these laws, they have the upper hand. So it really goes state to state, but there is a trend, no doubt, national politics toward everybody being sent a ballot, and that's that. And when that's the case, the Democrats could easily clean up.
I want to ask you a question about that in a second, but first I want to take Bree's super chat here. This is why we need to focus on the secular and science part of the argument, as well as supporting women who keep their babies. There are groups that are doing this, but we need more. I completely agree. I think that if conservatives want to win the battle on abortion, they need to focus on culturally, not politically, because culturally I do actually think there's a lot of progress that can be made. There's different, or I know there's different organizations that will help women out financially. If finances are the only reason they're having an abortion, there are services like that. And that's what I think that conservatives should focus on. If they really want to, prevent more abortions, then they need to get into the hearts and minds of people, not using the legislative pen to try to get their way. I want to go back to what you were saying about Florida and ballot harvesting and all of this stuff, though, because Charlie Kirk a couple of hours ago tweeted out something to the effect of, if the Democrats are going to harvest ballots, we should do it too. And we're going to gear up and have the most massive ballot harvesting initiative ever in 2024. And part of me was like, I like that they're thinking about this, but I also have to question with organizations like Turning Point USA, which takes in millions and millions and tens of millions of donations from conservatives every single year. Do you think an organization like Turning Point USA had any impact on getting youth voter turnout? And because my kind of opinion on it is that they take their money and they spend it on their big conferences and having basically a giant party, but it doesn't actually end up resulting in youth voter turnout. And a follow up to that is, I guess so after the 2020 election, there was this Time magazine article that basically laid out exactly what the Democrats did to fortify the election in 2020. And there wasn't anything really illegal about it. They were just very strategic about where they were putting their resources and coordinating across these units and stuff like that. So number one, did Republicans effectively get out the youth voter turnout with their tens of millions of dollars invested in Turning Point USA? And follow up to that, what do they need to do before 2024?
Well, the first question is easier to answer than the second, but as far as the first one goes, no, of course, the whole Turning Point USA thing, it's not a scam. I don't think that's a good way of putting it, but it's
I would
also,
agree.
yeah, it's not effective. I would say it falls something more in the way of a waste of time. And of course, that means money, lots of money in the case of Turning Point, considering how much it raises. I think that Turning Point is not really in line with the priorities of Zoomers or some millennials. And I think it's mainly targeted at Zoomers. And I think that's just sort of there as something to use as a reason for activism, which probably would have happened anyway. And then, of course, you said there are the massive conferences where people have a lot of fun. So I think Turning Point, if they want to do voter turnout measures, if they're able to do it, why not? And as long as there's no regulation that prevents them from doing so. But I think that it's not so simple as to say, this is getting into the second question about 2024 or the follow-up. It's not so simple as to say, well, the Democrats do this, so we're going to do it too. The Democrats have been doing this for several years. And the bottom line is that Republican voters are very hesitant to vote by mail. They do not trust the electoral system. They have good reason not to trust it. If you see what goes on in places like California and such, where I believe they found ballots that were by the side of a road in a ravine or whatever. I mean, it just gets kind of ridiculous after a point. But but a lot of Republicans are very leery about the electoral system in general. Now, in some cases, they shouldn't be. There are places like, for instance, Florida, that have very well-run elections. Even somewhere like Delaware, Joe Biden's home state, they have very well-run elections. there's no reason to live in fear of the election process. But in other places like California or Nevada, there's great reason to be afraid. So Republicans, unfortunately, are just going to have a negative impression, even if the voting system where they live is totally safe, of voting by mail. And that's going to make it rather difficult to say, hey, guys, we want you to request the ballot and turn them in, blah, blah, blah. It's just you just can't expect these voters to act in the same way the Democrats do. So basically, trying to be a new and improved version of the Democratic voter turnout machine isn't going to work. It's just a difference of what people believe from one party to the next. What the Republicans should do, though, is try to maximize vote by mail. But they also should really create as positive an impression as possible of in-person early voting. The GOP in Florida did that. The GOP in some other places did not do that. Some people in some states think anything other than election day is going to be, the vote's just going to be thrown into a shredder, and that's just not true. So I think that the GOP needs to really focus nationwide, wherever it's available, on maximizing in-person early voting turnout. That would be the key, and it certainly can do that. Even if it's busing people to the polls, literally, rents a Trailways bus and does that. But I would say that saying, well, the Democrats do this, so we're going to do that. It's if you're talking about your average Republican voter who doesn't trust the Postal Service, let alone his or her state secretary of state or local supervisor of elections, that dog's not going to hunt.
I agree.